1978 was the last year of the second generation front-wheel drive Eldorado that was originally introduced in 1971. That Eldorado followed up on the first generation front-wheel drive Eldorado that was introduced in 1967 and continued on through 1970. While 1978 represented the last year of the second generation Eldorado, it would be a great sales year for the vehicle as it sold almost 47,000 units in its final year. The Eldorado had been left behind in the downsizing of General Motors' lineup. The full-size vehicles had been downsized for the 1977 model year, like the Coupe de Ville, the Sedan de Ville, as well as the Fleetwood Brougham, which, by the way, now shared the same wheelbase as the de Villes. But the Eldorado soldiered on for 2 more model years after the de Villes and Fleetwoods had been downsized. And in 1977 and 78, it was the physically largest Cadillac in the showroom. Perhaps the Eldorado's supersized dimensions actually worked in its favor. Buyers of these personal luxury coupes wanted something with presence. Although I will say that the 1979 to 1985 Eldorado actually sold more per year on an average unit basis than even the 71 to 78 Eldorado, despite being downsized. In this video, we're going to tell you all the minutiae, the strange features, quirks, cool features of this 1978 Eldorado, so you can impress your friends at the water cooler knowing more than they do about this last of the big ones from Cadillac. Let's get started. First, let's take a look at the front of the vehicle. Now, you can tell a 1977 and 78 Eldorado from a 76 by a few ways. The first is the block lettering that spells out Eldorado there on the front of the hood. The second is the black paint surrounding the Cadillac emblem there on that piece of chrome at the end of the fender. That would not be painted black for the 1976 model year or the 75 model year. Now, this particular Eldorado that I'm showing is a Biarritz model. And you can tell that because obviously it says Biarritz on the sail panel, but also it has these stainless spears adorning the hood. The Biarritz package was introduced for 1976, and you could get one externally that looked very similar to this, but for those differences up front. And there are some styling differences in the rear, too, that I'll talk about. But those spears only came on the Biarritz. And, of course, there was a different interior, which we're going to see here in a moment. Other little fun facts and trivia about the styling up front here. One is that you notice these fender extensions, these pieces of rubber flubber, as I like to call them, that are in front of where the sheet metal fender terminates. That was done on both the front and rear of this car for crash worthiness, as the vehicle had to meet 5-mile-an-hour impact standards front and rear. Unfortunately, now that those fender extensions are getting rather aged, they tend to crack. And just so that you're aware, if you look at one of these vehicles, they are not cheap to replace. You should probably budget around $2,500 to $3,000 to replace them and have it done correctly, because the replacement parts are often not good fits, and you're going to have a good body guy fit it and then paint it. That's going to cost you a lot of money. One other tip about the front end here is you'll see this car has some of the headlights pointing downward. That's pretty typical on these because the headlamps are held in place against spring tension by these little plastic retainer clips. And again, as the vehicle ages, they tend to get old and brittle and break. Thus, basically, the spring pulls the headlamp in the downward direction. You can buy those retainer clips, and they're not really all that bad to replace. They're kind of a pain in the butt, but it's something that isn't all that hard to do. And a last little bit of trivia about the front end. You can tell a 1978 Eldorado from a 1977 model because the egg crate texture of the grille here is different than the more fine texture of the grille on the 77. Turning to the backside of the 78 Eldorado, you'll notice that the taillights are inset into that chrome piece of trim at the end of the fender. And the taillights were moved back there in 1977 after having been horizontal underneath the trunk deck lid in 1976. I'm not quite sure why Cadillac decided to make the taillights horizontally themed on the previous models, because the cars did still have that vertical fin that was a trademark for Cadillac, but instead of having a taillight in the fin, it was just a reflector. The taillights, again, were moved back into that chrome piece at the end of the fender for the 1977 model year and would continue there for 1978. Cadillac also put on that side marker light the block lettering spelling out Eldorado for 1977 that continued on into the 1978 model year. Also, notice out back here, there are these similarly large fender extensions, which again often crack, as do the fender extensions below the deck lid. You can tell these fender extensions are original because they have this piece of fake plastic chrome trim around them that is not on the replacements. And also that center filler panel in between the license plate and the bumper is silver. That is a factory panel. The replacements would generally be body color. With respect to the rear styling, notice the shape of the rear deck lid there. And imagine for a moment if you pulled the shoulders on either side of that raised surface more inward. What do you think it would resemble? A boat tail, perhaps? There is a little bit of a boat tail rear here on this 78 Eldorado. And remember, this was a time frame when in GM styling, the vice president in charge of GM styling, who actually departed in 1978, Bill Mitchell, was a big fan of the boat tail, and he was the driving force behind that 1971 to 73 boat tail Riviera. And you can see the designers paid homage to that a little bit here with the theme, although it's more muted than on that 1971 to 3 Riviera. The redesigned 1971 and 72 Grand Prix also had a similar rear theme, somewhat boat tail-esque. Lastly, you'll notice out in the rear here that the trunk kind of tapers to a point as it moves away from the center of the vehicle. And this was a characteristic element of styling that GM Vice President of Design Bill Mitchell just loved. He loved cars with that tapered look and sometimes tapering them front and rear like the Aerovet. But here, this car clearly just has the tapered rear. Now, one thing about Cadillacs is that you had to have cool features associated with them. And this 78 Eldorado, I think, has one of the largest cornering lamps that I've ever seen on a vehicle. It is only a single bulber, though. The 74 Cadillac up front had a double bulber, but it still, in terms of surface area, is immensely huge. And in some cases, Cadillac division actually had problems with the sheet metal rippling because the punch out for the cornering light was so large that it would affect the surrounding sheet metal. That is another interesting point to note, that the sheet metal on these vehicles from the windshield forward was executed by the divisions, like Cadillac division, but from the cowl rearward, it was executed by GM's Fisher Body division. So two different engineering groups and manufacturing groups made those different parts of the car. From the cowl forward, it was the division. From the cowl rearward, it was Fisher Body. And here's another cool feature of the 78 Eldorado. That's the fiber optic lamp monitors. These would help a driver better understand if the headlights, the bright lights, and the turn signals were working appropriately. And there were also lamp monitors in the rear of the vehicle mounted into the top of the roof that the driver could see in his or her rear view mirror. These lamp monitors up front just checked on the turn signals, headlights, and bright lights, as I mentioned, but it was a handy feature. These were not just turn signals as they were on many different Chrysler products, for example, but they were indeed lamp monitors without their own lamp, but fiber optics that were tied into the electrical system so you could determine if your lights were working. And another cool feature on these Cadillacs was this outside temperature thermometer that was integral to the driver's side outside rearview mirror. This was an optional feature, was not standard. But you can see it's got that red line on it, and the little wheel inside would rotate as the temperature changed. And the cool thing about this, beyond just being able to read the temperature outside from sitting in the car and taking a glance at this, was that it actually was illuminated at night so that you could see it even at night. Up front on the hood, we have, I think, the largest Cadillac hood emblem that was ever put on a Cadillac. This thing is absolutely huge. It's not as huge as the so-called Frisbee on the Escalades that would be placed on them, but it is huge and certainly huge for the time, but it makes a statement. You at least know where the front end of the car is at all times, and you see in the Cadillac logo there's what appear to be ducks, but those are actually what are called merlets, and those are actually feetless birds, so a little piece of trivia there for you in the Cadillac logo. Next, let's take a look at the tires, and the tires, you say? Why are we looking at the tires? Well, these are actually GM specified treads made by Uniroyal. So General Motors spec'd the tread design for these tires, And you notice here this tread pattern. This was unique to GM, and you can find it on the Eldorado. These are the original Uniroyal tires. So if you see an Eldorado with tires that have these treads, that is an original tire to the vehicle. Now let's turn to the inside of the car. You see these poofy button tufted seats that just look like they're so comfortable you would sink into them. And really they are, although I will say the foam durometer on that upper cushion is a little bit harsh. I wish on these it was a little bit softer, but they are still comfortable seats overall. These poofy seats were introduced for the 1977 model year, in spite of the Biarritz being introduced in 1976, and these seats were only offered in the Biarritz trim vehicles. So for 1976, the Biarritzes were really just exterior dress-up packages. In 1977, they gave you these poofy seats over the standard Eldorado seats, and I think that's a cool element of why probably quite a few people bought the Biarritz package. If we turn now to the dashboard of this vehicle, you can see this beautiful red dash with the white leather interior. I love this color combination. It's kind of like raw meat on the inside that you slice open. But notice the steering wheel. This steering wheel was introduced for the 1977 model year. It's a 2-spoke design, and it superseded a 3-spoke design steering wheel that was sunset after the 76 model year. But that 76 steering wheel would later make its way into Buicks and even into the GMC motorhome. But this 2-spoker was unique to Cadillac and would last 2 model years, 77 and 78. It is a tilt and telescoping wheel. This instrument panel was introduced for the 1974 model year. It has this dual plane theme, if you will, where all the warning lights are in that row above the speedometer. And beneath the warning lights are obviously the climate control on the driver's side, which I love. It's only on the driver's side. The cruise control, and then on the passenger side, you have the radio as well as the antenna controls. If we take a closer look at the driver's side controls, you'll notice that you have the climate control. There's actually an economy setting here, which is pretty humorous, but that was a setting in which the air conditioning compressor wouldn't run. It would run in the auto setting all the time unless it was below freezing, in which case the compressor wouldn't kick on. Also, while there's an off setting, the fan never really shuts off in these vehicles. It's always on a low speed. That was part of the flow-through ventilation system that started in 1971. You can see above the climate control panel the infamous joystick wiper control, which is horrendous. This car does have the optional delay wipers, and the problem with that is that control just feels cheap. And in order to get the wipers to wipe, if you want to move from the delay setting, you have to crash through the off position and then move to low, medium, or high. It's a 3-speed wiper switch. But sometimes when you crash through that off position, the wipers turn off and park and then have to restart, and it's not what you want to have to do as the rain is coming down you with a greater intensity. I will also say that these have a curious cruise control switch. In order to activate the cruise control switch, you have to flip that switch on the dash and then depress the button at the end of the turn signal stalk. But this cruise control switch that's on the dash is actually 3 positions. There's off, then there's a mid position, which it is in this particular photo, and then there's the auto position, which you could push it up to lock in there. In the auto position, that would enable the resume and accelerate feature on the cruise control. If you just left it in the cruise position where it is now, you'd only be able to use the set feature of the cruise control. I guess GM did that because that resume and accelerate feature was new and novel, and maybe it scared people that the car could actually accelerate on its own up to a different speed, but for whatever reason, they did that for a few years, and here it is on this car. Let's take a closer look for a second at the headlamp switch, and you notice that there are a couple dials that you can rotate surrounding that headlamp switch. The upper portion is for the Guidematic automatic headlamp dimming. You can see there it says off and far. You'd basically rotate that dial, and that would enable the automatic headlamp dimmer. So you'd turn on the bright lights. They would be on all the time until the system sensed oncoming lights, and it would automatically dim them for you and then return to the bright lights after it no longer sensed any oncoming light. Kind of a cool feature, but it got annoying, I believe, and was really only useful on 2-lane country roads. You couldn't use it in town, and for that reason, it went by the wayside in the 80s, I believe. This car also has Twilight Sentinel that turns your headlamps on as well as leaving them on for a specified period after you shut the key off, and you can adjust the length of time that the headlights will stay on by the bottom dial. Here we have the passenger side controls. You'll notice a rear defogger, kind of a standard toggle switch, the auto antenna up and down, as opposed to this moving the antenna. When you push it up and raising it, you push this switch to the up setting, and then when you turn the radio on, the antenna will go up. It's kind of a strange way to do this, but that's how Cadillac affected, as opposed to Ford, where you actually had to raise and lower the antenna. On this, it would automatically raise and then lower the antenna so long as you had that switch thrown into the up setting. You can also see here on the underside of the dash pad is the passenger side remote control mirror. Kind of hidden there, but it exists. And one other tip I will say, you'll notice here the speedometer, the index pointer for the Perndle indicator, or the park, reverse, neutral, drive, low, often on these is a little bit off. You can adjust that by removing the bottom dash panel, and you'll see a little set screw and a slot. That basically moves the index pointer as you rotate the column shifter. And if that's true on yours, that's how you fix it. It's about a 10-minute fix. Very, very easy. If we take a look at the passenger side here, you'll notice that there's a supersized removable litter container there in the kickwell area. That was a nice feature, although I don't know if you really want to litter in your car, but I guess if you did, you at least got to put in this removable basket. Notice on the door panel, there's this kind of gunstock texture to the faux wood grain. That's also true for the instrument panel. But one way to tell the 77 and 78 door panels from the 76 is that faux wood grain behind the casket handle there doesn't have a Cadillac logo, and it would in some previous years, including the 1976 model year. I will give you one tip, by the way. If you're trying to open these doors, don't push on that top portion of the door panel because you risk cracking it, especially in cold weather. Just push on the bottom portion to open the door. Here we've got a quick look at the floor and this, I believe, largest ever floor mat, or at least factory floor mat, produced in a vehicle. This is a one-piece floor mat for the Eldorados only. You notice the flat floor, and that's because this is a front-wheel drive vehicle. But that floor mat is one piece, and it was enabled by that flat floor. It's both good and annoying at the same time, because if you want to clean the floor mat and take it out, it's actually kind of hard to get out. It's pretty heavy. And nowadays, the rubber backing is a bit more brittle. You got to be careful that they don't crack. So just be gentle with your rubber floor mat. Now, as we turn under hood, these Cadillacs for 1978 had Cadillac's 425 cubic inch V8. It was introduced in the 1977 model year. It's effectively a downsized 500 cubic inch V8, and it made 180 horsepower in carbureted form. You could get an optional fuel injection, which was a multi-port setup, co-developed by Bendix as well as General Motors' Rochester division, that made 195 horsepower. So this car weighs in the upper 4,000s, around 4,800 pounds, I believe. So you're not moving with a heck of a lot of speed, although the torque is pretty decent at 320 pound-feet. The engine is still not the same as the 500. I love the 500 in these if you're going to get one, but that means you got to get a 1976 model year version as opposed to 77 or 78. And if you really want to impress your friends, the 425s are painted a different color starting in 1977 versus the 1976 500s. Those 1976 and earlier 500s were painted a very dark blue, and you can see this is kind of a medium blue. So different paint color under hood. If you're trying to restore your car, make sure you get the right Cadillac color. I will also tell you that orange dot on the air cleaner snorkel as well as the supersized wing nut are factory elements. So you want to see those if you want something that's completely original. Let's now take a look at this distributor cap. By this point, GM had introduced its HEI system, or high energy ignition, and as opposed to having points, this is a breakerless setup. But the interesting thing about this is that in order to change the distributor cap, you actually have to remove the coil from the cap. It sits under that cover there. And what you do is you take the cap off the car, and the coil is integral to the distributor cap. And then you remove the cover, you take out the coil, you put it in the new distributor cap, and you put the cover on that. So you have to move the coil and migrate it over when you change the distributor caps on these. It sounds like it might be a bit of work. It's really not. The cap comes off with two little screws, and it takes all of a couple of minutes to move the coil over. It's really, really easy. Next, under hood, we have this load leveling compressor there on the left for the rear suspension. These did have automatic level control. The reason why I'm highlighting it is because in previous years, Cadillac had employed a vacuum-based automatic level control, which was set in the passenger side fender well area. But by this point, they had transitioned to this little electric compressor, which actually was much better, more effective, and only ran part-time. That vacuum compressor was always running and ticking away, and you could hear it when the car was running. This was silent unless it needed to level the rear of the vehicle. You also notice that this car doesn't have the typical vacuum booster. Instead, it has a hydro boost setup, and that is basically an assist function that is driven off of the power steering pump to help you with the pressure needed to activate the four-wheel disc brakes on this vehicle. That's right, this car does have four-wheel disc brakes. I'm not quite sure why GM employed the Hydro Boost setup, as on the DeVille and Fleetwood series, they did have the vacuum-based setup, so I'm assuming the car had enough vacuum to operate correctly, because there really weren't any more accessories, vacuum-based accessories at least, that had to be driven off of the engine on the Eldorado versus the DeVille and Fleetwood. Maybe it's because these had four-wheel discs. I'm not quite sure, but the Eldorados had the Hydro Boost setup, and the rest of the Cadillac lineup did not. If you crawl underneath these cars, here's the oil drain plug, but one thing to bear in mind is that there isn't just one oil drain plug on these Eldorados, there's actually two. There's one that is ahead of the half shafts, and to change the oil, you're supposed to actually drain the oil out of both areas. There's only a little bit of oil that comes out of the second drain plug, but when I had one of these vehicles, I definitely removed both of them and got all of the oil out, but it's the only car, at least the car from this era that I know, that has two drain plugs on it. And last but not least, here's a picture of the rear suspension. These cars had torsion bar front suspension, coil rears, but I wanted to show this to you because you can see those rear calipers that comprise the braking system in the rear. And the interesting thing about these is that the braking proportioning is set up such that the rears lock pretty easily, especially in the snow. Now, if you know how to drive, it can be fun because you can do a lot of power slides around the corner in the snow. I had a 76 Eldorado as a daily driver, and it was a hoot. I think every corner I went around, I would slide the back end out, and people would point and laugh, but it really was a lot of fun. I don't think that was the design intent of these vehicles, but they are definitely overly biased toward the rear. I didn't notice that, and I haven't noticed that in driving the DeVilles and Fleetwoods of the era, but certainly all the Eldorados that I've driven, I've owned many of these cars. I think I've owned a total of 5 Eldorados of this era, and they all had similar brake proportioning. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this detailed look at the 1978 Eldorado and all of its features and quirks. If you did, let me know about it. What's the coolest feature and quirk that I mentioned? Put it in the comments section. Thanks again. Until next time, take care.